Chiang Kai-shek had nearly wiped out the communists. But he faced another threat, a foreign threat, which many considered more dangerous than the communists: Japan. For years, Japan had had economic interests in North China and Manchuria. Throughout the 1920s, it expanded its interests and defended them with increasingly hostile military activity. Japan's aim was to colonize China. The Japanese posed the greatest threat to the warlord of the region, Zhang Shiliang. Zhang Shiliang was one of the most powerful men in China. He was the Generalissimo's second in command, and he retained his own huge, well-equipped army. In September 1931, the Japanese attacked Zhang Shiliang's troops.
We bore the brunt of the attack. The brigade commander gave orders. First, he telephoned me and asked me about the situation. Then he gave the order, "Don't resist. You are not permitted to resist." I pointed out that the enemy had already begun to attack. He said then, "Collect the soldiers' weapons and hide them in the storehouse." I said that there was no way I could collect the soldiers' weapons and hide them when the enemy was shelling us. He said, "Then why don't you withdraw?" I said, "I have only received an order to offer no resistance. I have no order to withdraw." He said, "It would be better if you withdraw, otherwise you will be held responsible." Then the phone was cut off.
The Chinese troops did not resist, and the Japanese quickly seized control of all of Manchuria. Chiang Kai-shek, afraid the Japanese military would crush China, had chosen a policy of non-resistance. His deputy commander, Zhang Shiliang, protested the situation. Many held him responsible. Others believed he had received orders from Chiang Kai-shek, and they blamed the government.
We should have resisted. If I had been brigade commander, I would not have withdrawn. I would have resisted until daylight. When a foreign army attacks the cities of another country in broad daylight, I don't think that can be justified to the world.
We have a saying, an army is maintained for 1,000 days to be used for one. Why didn't they fight? I was very angry.
The Japanese used Chinese protests as an excuse to attack Shanghai. This time, there was hard-fought resistance.
Hello, everybody. This is Floyd Gibbons speaking. This was the last stand, the last barricade of the Chinese forces of the 19th Route Army that opposed the advance of the Japanese Marines through these ruins. Hardly a month ago, families lived in these places, fathers, mothers, and children. This was all that they had in the world.
In that part of Chapei occupied by the Japanese, all means of communication are being destroyed. All Chinese found in this quarter are forced to undergo a thorough search as snipers. Possession of arms is taken as conclusive evidence of guilt, and the punishment is certain death.
A ceasefire was declared in Shanghai, but prospects for peace were dim. On March 1st, 1932, Japan set up a puppet government in Manchuria, which they renamed Manchukuo. They installed the former boy Emperor Puyi, now a young man, as head of state. The The Chinese were angered and humiliated by the Japanese attacks and by the government's response. These feelings were expressed in demonstrations, the arts, and in feature films.
同胞们，起来！起来去杀尽我们的敌人！同胞们，走！三个敌人，三个，突击起来！民主万岁！
But demonstrations against Japan were quickly suppressed by the government. Chiang Kai-shek was afraid these disturbances would provoke another attack, which China would not survive.
We weren't ready. We couldn't let a little event trigger a war between China and Japan before we were ready to fight. The best way out was to persuade the Japanese to give up the idea of invasion. We tried everything.
The nationalist policy was that to resist foreign aggression, the country first needs internal pacification. This was stated by Chiang Kai-shek, and it was in all the papers. It was absolutely necessary to wipe out the communists before we could fight Japan.
Mao and Zhu De knew that Chiang would strike while they were still weak from the long march. In an effort to prevent this and to harness popular anti-Japanese feeling, Mao called for the nationalists to unite with the communists against Japan. Mao declared, "We cannot even discuss communism if we are robbed of a country in which to practice it." But Chiang continued his plans to attack the communists. Again, Zhang Xuliang, seen here next to Chiang, disagreed. He and his men only wanted to fight Japan to recover their homeland. But they could not make the Generalissimo change his mind. In December 1936, in a desperate act which shocked the country, Zhang Xuliang ordered his commander kidnapped. Sun Mingzhu and some heavily armed soldiers stormed Chiang Kai-shek's residence.
When I got to the bedroom, I saw that it was a mess and no one was there. I felt Chiang Kai-shek's bed. It was still warm, so I knew he hadn't been gone long. So we went up, and behind the hill, I saw him squeezed between two rocks. It was a spot that everyone called Tiger Stone Rock. He was standing there. He was very frightened. His face was covered with dirt. He was in pajamas because he hadn't had time to get dressed. I saluted and said, "Please, Generalissimo, come quickly." I was afraid that someone might shoot him. I felt a heavy responsibility.
The day he was kidnapped, our Central Committee immediately held meetings. In the evening, we held an emergency meeting. Everyone was trying to figure out how to save him. Madame Chiang flew to Xi'an.
Chiang Kai-shek feared he would be put on trial and executed.
If anything should happen to Mr. Chiang, no one in China would be able to fight Japan. Nobody would be able to stop Japan, and the Japanese would certainly march into China. That would be certain. No one would resist.
All China watched as his fate hung in the balance. Shanghai, China, the Paris of the Orient. In newsreels of the 1920s and 30s, life here looked fun, an exotic mix of East and West. The reality of China was different. Most Chinese lived in the country, where their lives continued largely untouched by the 20th century.